Open chat. All right. How found question mark. All right. I think everything's good. It looks good on my end. Jadon, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your channel before we get started?
Yeah, so my name is Jadon Havener. I just like really recently started my YouTube channel, Confident Faith. I started it just because, in between work, I didn't really have much to do. So I decided I was really interested into apologetics and I was learning that. So I decided to start the YouTube channel. And as I learned, just kind of upload what I've learned. And that's part of the reasons why I agreed to come on the discussion because I don't think I have necessarily anything to bring to the stream from my own experience because I've only been interested in philosophy for about like a year maybe now. So I know I didn't really come here to like win an argument or win a debate because I don't think that's going to happen. But I mostly came on just to learn, try different things with Tom, see what he thinks. And if nothing else, I'll at least learn something from the stream. So that's why I decided to come on.
Cool. Sounds good to me. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe that everything is best explained by naturalism and atheism. Could you tell me what you believe are good reasons to believe in theism or what it best explains? And I can tell you my thoughts on those positions and hear your thoughts on my position.
Yeah. So whenever I say I'm a theist, what comes to mind is I believe that there's good reason to believe in God. That is, that I hold the belief in God is internally coherent, and that the hypothesis, let's say God exists, has sufficiently explanatory powers, say for like the beginning of the universe. I think if you take a cumulative case approach, which I know you hear this a lot on your streams, I've heard a lot of Christians say this, but I think there's some truth to that. If you take a cumulative case approach, I think it makes the hypothesis God exists probable. And that's at least a reason I think to believe in a God. For example, some cosmological arguments may try and explain a sufficient cause for the universe, starting with finite objects, or the existence of a complex, or from the existence of a complex physical universe. Now, obviously, you and me would both agree these arguments don't necessarily get you to a belief in, let's say, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It doesn't necessarily get you specifically to Christianity all by itself, but it certainly, I think, does raise the probability for, let's say, the existence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or specifically theism, because the God of theism or God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob does seem to have sufficient explanatory power for bringing about the universe. So if you could show that the universe does have a explanatory power, like let's say a first cause or a first mover, I think that's at least a little bit, at least it makes it more probable. And this taken with the resurrection of Jesus, which we can get into later. I wasn't going to right now in the opening just for time, but I think it raises the probability of theism. And in the end, if you weigh all other inductive arguments for God's existence, like the teleological argument, fine tuning, which I don't plan on necessarily getting into those because I'm not as read up and learned on those specifically, but I think that taken together, it makes the hypothesis God exists more probable than, let's say, the naturalistic hypothesis. And I think that if you're able to show at least that that certain evidences makes it more probable that you may disagree with this, but at least that's it. That's, if nothing else, a reason that you could believe it.
Sure. I mean, I think that's fair. Like if you have evidence that
Yeah, I
makes
think your
one,
mic's muted.
oh yeah, forgot I muted that. So yeah, I think that's fair. Like if you have evidence that makes one conclusion more likely than another, that's definitely counts as evidence. But what do you think it is that makes theism more likely? So, like you mentioned, the cosmological argument. How does God act as any explanation for the cosmological argument? Because to me, it just seems like people are positing, if there's super powerful being, it could have created the universe. But you could just say that about anything. You could say if there's a super powerful pineapple, it could also have created the universe. It seems like a much better explanation is that given the current laws of physics that we know about, any of the models in physics are the better explanation because they have a basis in reality. Whereas the God hypothesis is just asserting if this thing exists, it could explain X, but you could just say that about anything. So why would the God hypothesis count as a better explanation here?
So I think before we get any further, it would help if I formulate a, a form of a cosmological argument because I don't think there's one individual cosmological argument. The one I was planning on using was Leibniz's cosmological argument. I think if I just presented this, it would at least help us to get somewhere further, which I'll go ahead and answer your question. But first, I want to formulate it just so I feel like it would help us get further. So, which you're probably familiar with it. Premise one: anything that exists has a sufficient reason for why it exists, either in another contingent being or a necessary being. Premise two: the world exists, therefore, the world has sufficient reason for why it exists, either in another contingent being or in a necessary being. Premise four: but the sufficient reason for why the world exists cannot be in another contingent being, since A, the world is just a collection of all contingent beings, and B, the sufficient reason for the collection cannot be in its parts, individually or collectively. Premise five: so a sufficient reason for the world must be in a necessary being outside the world. Premise six: therefore, there is a necessary being outside the world. And the only reason why I said that was I think it'll help, because there are many different formulations of a cosmological argument. So that's why. But um, but to answer your question, I think there's good reason to think that there is a necessary being outside the world, which is why I used this specific argument, because I thought it was relevant. So that being said, I think that that's best explained on a theistic worldview than it is on the naturalistic worldview, which I do know that you grant that there is a first cause, which we can get into that later. But as of right now, that's what I would say.
Well, sure. I mean, we all agree that there's some fundamental nature to reality, and we can call that the necessary thing. But the idea is that what is the best explanation of what this is? It seems like the best explanation is what's provided in physics, quantum field of some kind. That seems to be a much better candidate for the necessary thing than a god, because it seems like we have good evidence that quantum fields exist, and they have certain properties of like being outside of space-time that are clearly possible given physics. Whereas the God is just kind of something that we've imagined, it seems like, and we're just asserting it could do this with no evidence, as far as I could tell. So it seems like the quantum field hypothesis is supported by a significant body of evidence that is shown to be true independent of our imagination. Whereas God is just, we imagine this thing and we assert it could do X, which to me doesn't seem any different than saying there's a magical pineapple that I assert exists that could do X. So why would the God hypothesis count as a better explanation here? Because it seems like to me it doesn't at all.
So I think what you think that most, at least correct me if I'm wrong, what most cosmological arguments do is that they um, show the effect, let's say, the universe, and then they work backward and say the cause or God is sufficient to explain this. And you would say that just because it's sufficient doesn't mean that it's probable. Is that what you would say?
Well, no. So my argument here is that anyone can make up an object, give it a label, call it Bob, and then say Bob could explain X. Anyone can do that. That's not doesn't make it a good explanation. So you would need some additional feature in your argument to explain why this is a good explanation, why God has explanatory power, other than just saying it can explain X. The assertion that something could explain X isn't explanatory power, it doesn't
Mhm.
explain anything. So, what is it about your hypothesis that makes God, it gives God explanatory power that the quantum field doesn't have?
Okay, so I would say what gives God. Would you say that one more time? I was focused on the last part. I wasn't sure what you're saying.
Yeah, so you're saying that God has explanatory power to explain all contingent things or the universe or whatever way you want to phrase it. And my argument is that what about God gives it explanatory power? Because to me, it only seems like the only explanatory power it has is that we've imagined this thing and we assert it can do something. That's the only explanatory power it seems to have. Versus a quantum field seems to have a significant amount of explanatory power because we know it exists. We know these things are real. They're independent of our imagination. They exist outside of space time. These are all things that are very well established in physics. This seems to have a lot of explanatory power, whereas the God doesn't seem to have any, as far as I can tell. It's just, again, something we have imagined to exist, and we have imagined it has explanatory power.
Yeah, so I'd say that let me think how I'd formulate this. Let's see. So I'd say what gives God the ability, or what makes it sufficient to be an explanatory power, not just something we make up. Well, this is the effect, and I'm just going to say this sufficiently explains it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's likely. And part of that is whenever I think most people, when they think about the idea of a first cause or a first mover, I think that what we're talking about there is what would be um, is what we mean by God, a first mover who is outside nature, who has the sufficient power to bring about said nature. And I think if you um, and I think that if you weigh that in light of other arguments, that it makes, this is how I'm getting a specific theism, because I know you reject that, but um, I think that if you show that there's a first uncaused cause that's outside the universe, that created the universe, that's good reason to think that that's good reason to think that uh, there is a God. And I think if you weigh that with other evidence, it makes that apparent.
Okay, so I'm asking how, because obviously whatever this first cause is, it's in reality, so it exists, right? It's a real thing. So
Mm.
this thing that's in reality could be a conscious entity in a non-embodied mind of some kind, a god, or it could be just a natural quantum field. Both of those things exist in reality, or could exist in reality, and they could both explain the universe. They created everything outside of themselves. So why would the god be better here? Why does the God have more explanatory power when the quantum field has lots of things we can demonstrate exist? We know they're real. We know they have effects in reality. This seems to have a lot of explanatory power and a strong basis in reality, whereas the God, as far as I can tell, doesn't have any basis other than we imagined it and asserted it could do this. So both of these hypotheses fit all of the data you have presented, and the quantum field seems to be better. Why would it not be?
Are you saying why the quant why it's why are you trying to ask why God would be a better explanation for it versus other
Yes. So
hypothesis? Or
so when you're talking about explanatory power, what counts as explanatory power, Um, I'm saying that you have this piece of data, the universe exists, contingent things exist, and you have some required thing to explain that, the necessary thing. So we want to know what is the necessary thing, and it seems to me that the best explanation of that is quantum field, not God. Like quantum field has real explanatory power; it can actually explain things, but the God doesn't seem to have any explanatory power. It just seems to have imagined to have explanatory power. So why do you think, what about the God hypothesis was better or does anything to the same level or better than the quantum field hypothesis? Like, why would this be a good explanation at all?
what do you mean by explanatory power when you're talking about the quantum field specifically?
Well, that's kind of what I'm asking you. Like, you're claiming God has explanatory power, and I want to understand by your definition what about the God has more or equal or some in some way some explanatory power that isn't better explained by the quantum field. So I'm specifically asking for your definition here. What do you mean by explanatory power? What do you mean by God having explanatory power? Because what it seems to me that you mean, or that most theists mean, is that I imagine God could do X, and that's what you count as explanatory power. So I'm curious what your definition of it is, and what about that definition can't be applied to the quantum field.
Um, if I were to try to explain that, as far as right now, it wouldn't be honestly honest, because right now I can't really think of anything specifically that I'd use as a justification for that. If I'm going to be honest.
That's fair. Um, So, just going based off of that argument on its own, would you agree that just for now that the quantum field seems to be a better hypothesis than the God hypothesis? Just on that argument alone.
On the specific one I gave.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it would, in order to clarify, um, so when you're talking about the quantum realm, whatever, are you saying that? Are you postulating that that's outside the universe? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, it created the universe. So, whatever created the universe exists in reality. Reality is everything that exists, and the universe is our stuff, the stuff that we interact with. But it's not everything in reality. There's other stuff outside of our universe. And the necessary thing is obviously one of those things. And there are quantum fields that are outside of our universe just fine. So, whatever those quantum fields could have created our universe, and they're outside of our universe. They're not outside of all things. They exist in reality, just like God exists in reality. But I think that's one of the confusions in these kinds of conversations is that there's a conflation between our universe and all of reality. Being outside of our universe isn't really that special, but that doesn't mean it's outside of all nature or all
Mm.
reality, because that those are two different categories.
Yeah, so I get what you're saying. Yeah, because if it was outside of all reality, it wouldn't, it wouldn't be real, obviously.
Exactly.
Yeah. So 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 what I wanted to do here, because obviously, as you can see, I'm not as learned as other people you've had on this discussion. I'm not trying to like avoid questions, but what I think as far as going forward, what would be really beneficial to continue having this conversation, why it was even worth having in the first place, is because um, I think it would do good, especially since I have just recently got into this, and I mostly came on just so I could learn and bounce ideas off your head, and that's why I was honest. But I want this to be more of like a conversation, like to kind of help me understand. I mostly came on to learn, so
Oh yeah,
I'm
yeah,
clarifying
I'm
that.
totally fine with that. So
No, no,
I just want
the
to
only reason why
clarify.
I'm clarifying.
I want to just make one. So I'm not trying to like convert you to atheism here. If
No, I understand that. Yeah.
from based on like what I've presented so far, I'm asking you, does it look like my evidence is better than the evidence you currently have? And then if so, then you can go check up with other philosopher theists and say, well, how would you respond to this? And say, oh, their evidence is better, and then get like a back and forth to get better evidence both
Okay.
ways.
Yeah. So I see what you're saying now. The only reason why I was clearing for that is because I was going to ask what you meant, why you think quantum would be outside, and I didn't want to seem like I was just attacking you. But I understand what you're saying now. That as as far as the evidence that I'm aware of right now and that I presented, does it seem more? So I would say yes, as far as on the evidence I currently understand. Yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. And you said there were other arguments you wanted to present other than the cosmological, like the resurrection, or you said you didn't want to talk about the fine tuning, but I'm happy to talk about that one too. Like, what
Yeah.
are
The only
the
reason why I said I didn't want to is because I'm not as read up on those and anything like that. So
Oh yeah, and I
that's
want
why.
to clarify. So it's totally fine that you're not read up. The fact that
Yeah.
I may know more about you than a topic doesn't mean that atheism wins and that theism loses.
Yeah,
So
I understand. The only reason why I wanted to clarify that is because whenever you're on a discussion like this, obviously, and as far as to the audience, I don't know. That's part of the reasons why when you first asked me to come on, I didn't. I was like, because I didn't think I had anything to bring necessarily because I was still learning. That's why. But yeah, so
yeah, the most important thing to me is more about the conversation and the idea. So can you
mm,
admit that from the evidence you have so far, is what I presented better so far? And you did, and that's extremely intellectually honest of you. That's a really good thing to be proud of that many people don't do, on both sides. And so I would just want to go through your current level of knowledge and the arguments and
mm,
see if I can present a
okay,
better case from the atheist side to your current level of knowledge.
okay,
And then
that
you can
makes
use
sense.
that and then go back to talk to other theists and be like, okay, so he presented a better argument for me so far. How do you defeat this? That kind of a
Yeah,
thing. So
so
it's
it
just
kind of
a
promotes. So it promotes healthy and I'm trying to think of the word. I'll just say healthy
this,
discussion and thinking.
yes.
Yeah. Okay. So that being said, I wanted to ask you what you thought about because I mean, you probably heard almost every formulation of the possibility of the resurrection of Jesus. So I want to know what your thoughts are on that specifically and why it doesn't work specifically.
Well, yeah, so it definitely works. If there's magic, you can raise people from the dead. So it's a
Okay.
possibility. But I would say that would that be the better explanation to explain all of the facts of Jesus' resurrection? And this is the part where I get very confused on when listening to people like Braxton Hunter and Mike Winger say that, oh, the resurrecting from the dead is the best explanation of these facts. To me, that seems very, very strange because all of the facts seem to be very easily explained by things we already know about. Like bereavement delusion is a experience people have of if they have a loved one die or someone significant or important in their life die, they will have physical and auditory experiences of that person after they're dead. They will see the dead person. And it happens to like 60% of people. It's a very large common feature. And that explains pretty much everything the apostles experienced. Um, and then there's the sighting of the 500. Like, even if we grant that it happened and it wasn't just a story added in later, we could say that, well, that happens all the time too. When people see UFOs, the miracles at Fatima, I don't know if you think those are real or not, but there's miracles of Hindu miracles, seeing Santi Sai Baba. There are tons and tons of miracles that a large group of people all experience seeing at the same time, and they all attribute it to a deity or a spirit or a ghost or whatever. And we know this is a certain kind of social conditioning. We know this is also a thing. I forget what the actual term is. I have it saved somewhere, but We know this is a very common feature, happens all the time. Nothing surprising about this one bit. So that explains the sighting of the 500. Paul's conversion on the road, also experienced by bereavement delusion. People who persecuted Nazis and killed lots of people often have emotional regrets and can also experience bereavement delusion and conversions. So all of the features of the Jesus story seem to be extremely common in human history. So like if you see a hoof print in the ground, you say, you know what, that's probably caused by a horse. Horse probably the best explanation. Unicorn probably not the best explanation. And the same thing seems to apply to the resurrection. Every single part of the story is an extremely common feature in human psychology throughout history. I don't see anything about it that would require an explanation of a miracle here. And so I don't understand why theists think that a resurrection is actually a better explanation when it seems like claiming that a unicorn caused a horse print that we've seen a million times. Like it doesn't seem reasonable to me to infer the resurrection occurred based off these very common facts.
So whenever the most common one is the minimal facts approach, which I'm sure you know. I think Israel actually presented that in your last debate with him. So obviously, like, I mean, you've dealt with a lot of theists, so you know what they're trying to say. So I'm going to be brief on this. They try to say that what's best explains these facts is Jesus supernaturally rising from the dead. And so do you think that the alternative explanation is more reasonable than him rising from the dead?
Yeah, by like a lot. So like if you saw a footprint in the snow or whatever, and it looks exactly like a horse, and you'd say, is this better explained by a horse or a unicorn? Like obviously it's the horse. There's a very common thing, we see it all the time. It's probably explained by all of the evidence we have of the things that cause that. And that's what I see in the resurrection case. All the minimal facts are extremely common things. Like there's nothing about that that isn't just a hoof print in the snow, which is why I don't really understand why theists think the resurrection is a better explanation here.
Okay. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, so it's kind of based on like human experience in a way, and that like we know this many times that the hoof print has been a horse. So it's highly probable to conclude that the hoof print is a horse, not a unicorn, right? Um, so I remember I was watching the thing with William Lane Craig and a couple other people, and he was saying that even if that if it's even possible that God exists, it's possible that a miracle could exist, which I'm sure we agreed on. But the question is, how would you go about demonstrating that it's a miracle? So, so what would you say? Like, so how could even? Because I'm sure you're way more learned up on the scientific theory and all that stuff. So how could you ever show that this is a miracle? Like, do you think it's even possible to even show that? Even
Yeah.
if it did occur, do you think it's possible for us to even demonstrate that?
Yeah. So if we have other like if we see a bones like ancient bones of a Tyrannosaurus Rex or whatever, and
Yeah.
we say, well, is this a real animal that used to live? Well, we can say if it's a real animal that used to live, we can predict other kinds of things about it. Like, well, we'll find that its teeth will be lodged in other animals we find or other bones we find in the area. We can find other different facts. We can find its footprints that are we can't see anymore because its feet don't have skin or anything on it, no muscle. But we can find the footprints of the same animal with all of its skin there that are in other kinds of fossils. So we can infer that if this was caused by a T-Rex, then there are other facts that we can also infer would happen. So if God is real and God can raise people from the dead, and if we pray to him, he will heal the sick or whatever, and it happened at a very high rate, that would be good evidence that this God exists. And yes, that it did happen that he raised Jesus from the dead. So like if I pray to God to heal the limbs of an amputee, and it happens every single time, and if it only works for the Christian God, for example, then it would be reasonable evidence to infer the same kinds of miracles happened 2,000 years ago. And so you could say, yeah, Jesus probably did raise from the dead because there's really good evidence that this praying to this Christian God thing actually exists. It works, it does stuff that we can't explain. And so it's pretty reasonable to infer it could do other stuff we can't explain too. So there are pretty easy ways to show that the miracle hypothesis could be justified if you have other evidence of miracles. But you would first need that other independent evidence of miracles before you could infer miracles caused the resurrection. So the same thing for like a horse. If we think that a unicorn caused the footprint in the snow, well, the first thing you would need is independent evidence of unicorns And then you could say, well, now that we have this independent evidence of unicorns, it could have caused the footprint in the snow.
So what would give it that the question I have is what would give it that independent um, evidence? So what the reason why I'm asking that is, do you think repeatability is essential to use as a basis? Like, because a lot of people would say that the resurrection of Jesus is that baseline that we can say, okay, this is a miracle. But do you think it needs repeatability to be able to show, okay, we know for sure this is a miracle? Is that what you would you agree with that?
Uh, Not exactly. No, I would say that the method I use is novel testable predictions. So if you give me novel testable predictions, I will be convinced. That's all I need. But if you can provide any method that you can think of that can differentiate imagination from reality, that's evidence. That counts. You don't need to use my method. My method is irrelevant.
Hmm.
Any method that can differentiate imagination from reality counts as evidence. Now, my method is, of course, novel testable predictions, which
Hmm.
has repeatability in it, but that doesn't make a difference to the criterion, which is just any way to differentiate imagination.
Okay. Yeah, and that makes sense too. I mean, like everything you say makes sense. It's not that. I mean, in some areas, I might disagree with you. I'm not gonna, convert to atheism over there, but I do understand what you're saying, and I think that at least that's helpful for a conversation. Um,
Yeah, and you can
what?
check in with Josh Rasmussen or William Lane Craig or any
Yeah,
other guys and see if they have better responses, and you can come back with those later.
yeah,
Sure.
yeah, yeah. Which I appreciate you, being understanding on that because, like, this is really more of like an interview in a way right now. I'm just asking, okay, I've heard a lot of this on the TS side. Um, Now I'm bouncing off your ideas, and I know that's probably not how you imagined it to be when it started out, but I appreciate your patience
Well,
with me.
that's kind of what I'm the goal of every conversation for me
Mhm.
is that it's just like I don't care about converting anybody. It's mostly just like a basketball game. You use your strategy, I use my strategy, see who gets more points, and then you change strategies to see which one's new strategies can overcome the old strategies. That's the whole
Mhm.
point of conversation and debate from my perspective, is just to learn new strategies and to become better acquainted with the arguments on the topic. So that is the entire point of my channel at every conversation I have.
Okay. Yes. So you said you want to talk a little bit about the teleological argument.
Oh yeah,
Um,
like whatever you would feel comfortable with in whatever you think is important in the cumulative case.
okay. Yeah. So let's talk about the teleological argument and your thoughts on it.
Sure. So the teleological argument says that given all the different ways the universe could have been, there's only a very small number that could permit life. And so it seems like
Hmm.
whatever caused the universe must have deliberately chosen this specific combination to get to what we have. Like if it was just random chance, it would be very strange that this combination of physics would come about. Um, and that's perfectly fine. But the problem is that the same argument applies to a god. To use Richard Dawkins' example, who fine-tuned the fine-tuner? He doesn't explain it very well, but the point is that for every possible different way the universe could have been, there's also a different way God could have been. If God must have had some reason to make a life permitting universe, like the theists usually say, he's a moral being. He wants other moral things to exist. But that could have been differently. Maybe God didn't want moral beings. Maybe there's a God who only cares about black holes, and so he just created a universe with nothing but black holes. Or maybe there's a God who only wants hydrogen atoms and only creates a universe of nothing but hydrogen atoms. So for each possible universe that could have existed, there is a possible God who could have designed that specific universe. And so, just like it's very unlikely that the universe came about by chance to produce life, it's very unlikely that the God came about by chance to create a universe with life. So, the same statistical probabilities apply both to the universe and to God. And so, if it's required that the universe be designed by something to explain the improbabilities, then it would also be required that God would have to be designed by something to explain why he has that particular set of properties to produce this universe. And if you say that, well, God doesn't need an explanation, he's a self explained thing, well, you can just say the same thing about the universe and say, well, it doesn't need an explanation, it's a self explained thing by the quantum field thing I was making earlier. So it seems to me that the fine tuning argument doesn't actually point to a God. All it does is it says, here's a really complicated thing we can't explain. Maybe it's explained by something else. But we could just say the same thing about the God. So
Hmm.
it doesn't seem to give any reason to actually believe the God hypothesis is true because it would also apply to the God hypothesis.
Okay. One thing that I know, a common response to that would be is that that the universe does seem like it shows. There's at least things you can point to that show that it did have a beginning, and I think that would differentiate from saying that, well, God. So, well, since there's no fine tuner for the fine tuner, maybe there's no fine tuner for this fine tuned universe. So, but there's a lot of people that would say, well, there's examples in the universe you can point to that show that there is a point in which it was fine tuned. So what would you say to that?
Well, I'd say that we could just imagine the like since we don't have any evidence that God exists at all, we don't have any way to show that he may or may not have had a beginning. We just don't know. It's
Mm,
just ambiguous essentially on the topic. Whereas because we do have lots of evidence of the universe, we can conclude it had a beginning. But the problem here is that if you want to say that because it had a beginning and because it's really complicated, it must have had a creator of some kind. Well, again, you could just say the creator is the quantum field thing. The quantum field thing is equally going to be fine tuned, but
mhm.
it didn't have a beginning. So you could say, all right, we have the same problem for a God, for a quantum field, for a universe. And if we just want to apply this to non-created or non things that don't have a beginning, we could just say, okay, so here's a quantum field, and it has a particular set of properties that create a life permitting universe, just like a God has a particular set of properties that create a life permitting universe. So the same thing would apply. It would just be like, so, well, why does the fine tuning argument count as evidence here? It just seems like you're saying that any contingent thing that had a beginning must have an explanation. Well, we can already grant that, but why would that lead to a God?
Okay, that makes sense. Um, what was I going to ask? I forgot what I was going to say. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So it seems that like that you'd agree with this that as far as what you think most theistic or not even theistic any explanation of the universe, it seems that that you would say that they're just arbitrarily saying, well, this would explain it, so therefore like we should believe it. So would you agree that like we have the phenomena, the universe having existing now, and of course you could find any explanation arbitrarily, just say, well, this would explain that or this would explain that. Is that what you think the theist is doing when he's presenting certain arguments? He just arbitrarily saying, well, this is we see that humans tend to strive for good, or this is relevant from what your view of morality is, but just the fact that most people would agree that there is at least some idea of morality, and then theists just arbitrarily say, well, God is morally perfect, so therefore that explains that. Is that what you think the theist does a lot?
Sort of like not intentionally. I think that,
Obviously
uh,
not intentionally, but
yeah, yeah. So I think that in order to count as a real explanation, you need some way to differentiate imagination from reality. And I don't think the theists provide that. I think, the thing that they're missing. And because they are missing that, what they're doing is no different from just imagining something and saying it can explain X.
okay, yeah. This might be interesting. What do you think personally is like one of the from your experience of having to dealt with theistic arguments, what do you think is an argument that you think is most um, reasonable, at least?
The DNA is a code argument. So DNA is a code. All codes we see are made by minds. Therefore, DNA was made by a mind. I think that was probably the most reasonable argument theists had 200 years ago or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that when we first discovered DNA, that's a pretty good argument. But then we had future evidence. We had a different hypothesis that DNA came about by natural processes. And that hypothesis made a whole bunch of predictions, novel testable predictions, which came true. And we discovered, yep, these are right. So this hypothesis is giving us knowledge which indicate it's probably correct, and the code argument is probably incorrect. So the code argument was probably the best at one point, but the reason I don't think it's good now is because the alternative hypothesis has made significant progress with testable predictions that indicate it's correct.
Okay. So that's fair. Um, what was I going to say? Let's see. We talked about the fine tuning argument. There's something I was meaning to ask you about. Let's see. I, here, I guess until I can remember, is there anything that you think that would be helpful as far as for me to help? That would be helpful for me to understand before maybe it'll come to me as we're talking.
Well, you mentioned the moral argument. So my position on the moral argument is that I think the secular approach to morality is a better approach. So with what the secular model does, like science, it observes a phenomenon, there's something that occurred, and then we try to find a pattern in the phenomenon, and then we create principles that describe the pattern. And then once we have those principles, we then try to discover what causes the principles, what is the source. Whereas theism seems to be going the other way around. So it starts with a God and then says, well, let's look at the evidence and see if we can make it fit the God hypothesis. So it starts with the conclusion and then tries to make the evidence fit the conclusion, whereas the secular model starts with the evidence and then lets the evidence lead to a conclusion. I think that for morality, why secular models of morality are better than theistic models is because of exactly that. They start with the evidence. They say that we have these moral intuitions. We see drowning babies for fun is wrong. Punching people for the face is wrong. And then we try to create patterns. We try to discover what the pattern is in these moral intuitions. And we describe those patterns with principles. And then once we have those principles, only then do we try to infer what is the grounds, what is the ontology of morality. And that's, we obviously we haven't discovered that. We admit that, yeah, we don't know what the ontology of morality is, but this approach seems to be a better approach because we're starting with the evidence and then following the patterns to try and get to a conclusion. Whereas the alternative of just starting with a conclusion like God and then working backwards to try and make the evidence fit. Again, anyone could do that, it seems like, with Platonic objects, with moral laws of nature. You could essentially just do that with anything. So the same reason as the physics explanations for the origin of the universe, it seems that the secular approach is a more reasonable, rational approach to try and understand what morality is than the theistic one. I don't see why asserting a god or why a god would be a better explanation just because it's asserted rather than trying to
Mm.
follow the evidence.
So and this is for future reference. Maybe later I can come back on. We can have like more of an actual, discussion. Like we're having a discussion now, but it's not necessarily, like a like battling ideas. We're just kind of anyway. Um, yeah. So you would say the theist needs to show why the God is um, how it works. So not just say that God is a grounds of morality, and therefore we explain morality. You'd have to the theist would have to demonstrate how there being a God or not even that, because you could arbitrarily say that too, how it does it.
Yeah, I would say that how does the evidence lead to the God is what they have to
Mm,
show rather than showing
yeah.
how God could explain the evidence. I want to know how the evidence leads to a God.
Oh, so work bottom up. Okay, not top. Yeah, okay. And I think that's fair. Yeah. So, yeah, so I think this would be helpful since we're on the topic of morality. A lot of people, like even Brex and Hunter, I've seen them make videos where they, which I don't want to like, you know, make him say something he's not saying, but I have seen many other theists say that, since TJump believes in objective morality, he's stealing from, or Frank Turek is big on this. He steals from God, which I've talked with you on your Discord chat. I don't think that's necessarily what you're doing. So, do you think that objective morality is just assumes there has to be a God, or
Definitely not. So
yeah,
most philosophers are atheists, like 70 something percent, and most philosophers are also moral realists. They believe in objective morality, even though they're mostly atheists. So objective morality predates God by a long time. Like Platonic objects are an objective morality that has no God in it. You don't need a God for objective morality at all. So it doesn't seem to make any sense to say you're stealing from a God because objective morality predates the idea of a God. Um, Even the earliest religions don't even have the idea of a God. It's more just there is a fundamental nature like karma or dharma or whatever, the Jainist approach. So it's not, it doesn't make, I've never really understood the theist argument that you're stealing from a God because all the things
yeah,
that you're saying we're stealing, you stole them from other secular places or secular religions that pre-existed God-based religion. So I've never really understood that argument very much.
okay. So, do you think this happens a lot? Which I know at least in some cases it happens. I'm not saying that this is the defeater for theism at all. I'm just saying that it seems like it happens a lot, and I've noticed this because, like me, I I've obviously grown up Christian, but I came to the point where like just because I think this is way doesn't mean it's true, and that's why I started looking into it. But I obviously there's a lot to understand, and that's why. But which later I want to ask you what you how would you go about actually learning practically? But anyway, um,
Well, actually, that's a great question. So I think this is the best way. So it's just like I think like any sport, you have a skill or a strategy and you play against other people. And as they beat you and you lose, you realize, oh, their strategy is better than mine. What can I learn from their strategy? And then how can I get a better strategy to beat them next time? And I think
Mm,
that's the best way to learn and progress in any skill set. I
yeah.
think there's a quote from the Fundamentals of Chess, 1883. The only way to get smarter is by playing a smarter opponent. So I think that
Mm,
this process of going into a conversation and losing, because I've lost several debates, unfortunately, is a way to learn from your mistakes and improve on the areas that you're weak in. And I think that's the best way to learn and approach any topic. I think book learning is kind of boring. Like just reading the book doesn't give you any real practical knowledge because
mm,
it's not applied against an opponent of some kind. Like to quote Jackie Chan, I think books don't hit back, whereas a debate
mhm,
they do, and so it's a lot more useful
mm,
to learn in a pragmatic application.
yeah. 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 So that's definitely helpful. Yeah. And what I was gonna ask specifically, which I always forget right when I'm about to ask. I don't know if I'm nervous or something, but oh yeah, yeah, yeah. So a lot of theists, would you agree with this? So a lot of theists, they have the preconceived idea, or at least maybe because I've talked with a lot of presuppositionalists, maybe that's the way I had this experience. But a lot of them, they have the idea God exists, and then they try to present that, and the atheist says, "Well, I don't think that's likely because of this," and then they go and they um, try to find arguments that would rescue them from that in the next debate. Do you think that's healthy, or do you think it's better just to work bottom up? Which obviously you say it's better to work bottom up, but just to say, here's what we need to explain, and then work up. Don't start from the top and then work down.
Um, I'm not sure. So I think it's fine to work from the top down if you can make some progress. You can say,
Mm,
if I believe God exists, if God exists, He'll answer my prayers. I pray for a gold brick appears, or whatever, and it
yeah.
works. That's fine. Like if you got knowledge top down and it makes some kind of difference in the world that can show it's not imaginary, that's fine. So I
Hmm.
don't think it matters one way or the other if you start bottom up or top down. All that matters is if you can show that whatever knowledge you gained is true, independent of your imagination. Um, I'm not sure I was following the part you mentioned about precept, like
Oh
rescuing.
yeah. The reason why I said precept is because I said I wasn't trying to make a blanket statement that all theists are like this. 'Cause I think that's not honest. But so that's why I clarified. Maybe it's because most people I've talked to are precepts. That's why it seems that they're presupposing God and then explaining. Oh well, yeah. So that's the only reason why I said that.
Yeah, I wouldn't see any inherent flaw with that if you
Mm,
could show it's real. Another thing, like remembering what to say, I do remember that was an issue for me starting off too. What I did was I
yeah.
just pulled up a Word document, and while they were speaking, I just wrote down like a one line thing of what I was saying, and then I could just go through the Word document to remember what I was trying to remember. That's what's helped me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, precept is a interesting phenomenon. I think that I'm fine with overall the approach, but the problem is that when they claim it's impossible to have knowledge if you don't presuppose God, that I think is a very problematic approach.
Yeah, it would depend on how you define knowledge too. Like, what you probably know this. I don't like this. Why I'm asking. I don't know. Do you think that precepts and let's say naturalists have different definition of what knowledge is? Because I know that a lot of people would say knowledge is justified true belief, right? Do you think that's what precepts are meaning when they say knowledge?
I sort of. They mean the same thing, but their definition of justification is different.
Oh,
So
okay.
usually precepts require absolute certainty, and if you don't have certainty, then it's not justified. Whereas most people in philosophy don't require certainty.
Yeah.
Fallibilism, the position is the consensus in philosophy, which is the position that literally you don't need certainty for knowledge. That's just definition of the position. So the precepts disagree with the majority of philosophers in their definition of justification, even though their definition of knowledge is about that.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. So, like, I mean, I'm sorry, like especially the audience. It seems like I'm all over the place, which I am. That's how I like. I'm just like I'm really bad at ordering my thoughts, which is why.
Don't worry about it all. You're doing significantly better than 90% of the people I talk to. So
So that being said, like scatterbrained, which you kind of alluded to this, but I wanted to hear more what what your opinion is more in depth on like how me where I'm at. So I've there are certain arguments that I've heard. I'm kind of like pretty much just dip my toe in the water, so to speak. And so how would you suggest I practically like get a better knowledge of it, and not just knowing okay when someone says this, I'm supposed to say this back because it makes sense. Like actually, truly, honestly inquire about is there really a God and do that honestly.
I think you should try to look into the different distinctions in philosophy. That's essentially the most useful thing philosophy has ever done is make distinctions between different kinds of knowledge and to show like is the claim that you're making, does the evidence that you're providing actually support the conclusion that you're espousing? So
Mm,
like a priori versus a posteriori knowledge, analytic versus synthetic, those kinds of distinctions show that it's impossible essentially to use certain kinds of statements like just pure logic, the law of identity, a equals a, non-contradiction, law of excluded middle. You can't ever get physical objects from that just using abstract laws of logic or math, abstract math, one plus one equals two. You'll never get apple from any kind of math because the a priori kinds of knowledge don't tell us anything about concrete objects. And there are tons of these distinctions in philosophy to try and build an architecture of epistemology that show what certain kinds of evidence can and can't do. And that's, I think, trying to understand those and build your own understanding of what good epistemology is. And then applying that in practice in conversations is probably the best way to learn. That's what I did. I wrote an epistemology, applied it in debates, saw what it did well and what it didn't do well, and improved over
mm,
time.
yeah, which I think that's fair. Honestly, like at least it's an at least it's an honest approach, and that's good. Yeah. So, um, yeah, so like, I mean, I'm just kind of saying whatever comes to my mind. So right now, this came to my mind. Most discussions that people have, it's not actually honest inquiry. It's mostly just like, which I don't think it's necessarily like dishonest to try to, stay true to your position because many people have thought through their position before. But it seems that a lot of discussions, they're like, it's not very helpful. It's just like, in a way, like for example, I was on the TART Monday night live stream where they took questions, and I was just listening, and there's a guy that called in, and he was like, "So you used to be a Christian, right?" He's like, "Yeah," and he's like, "So that means you believed you were indwelt with that means you were indwelt with the Holy Spirit." He's like, "I believe that was." He's like, "Oh, so then you just stop, so you just let the Holy Spirit leave you," and like they weren't actually getting anywhere. Like obviously the guy was presupposing that the Holy Spirit existed because the guy obviously doesn't believe it exists. Do you think that happens a lot in Christian circles versus like anything like that?
Well, it happens a lot on both sides. I think that it's lots of people who aren't specifically trying to be intellectually honest and are more just trying to to support their emotional biases, confirmation
Mm,
bias. That happens all the time, but I'm okay with it for the most part. Like if someone presents an argument, uh, just trying to confirm their biases and they're not being like an honest interlocutor, I really don't care because I'm interested in their argument. Like
yeah.
if I can address their argument one way or the other, whether or not it convinces them doesn't really make much difference to me because again, I'm just looking for the experience of being presented challenging arguments so that I can learn my weaknesses and improve. And whether or not they're being honest doesn't make a difference. Their argument is good or bad regardless of their intentions. So even though there are lots of people who are trying to support their confirmation bias, I think that that can be a road to more rational discourse. Like I was doing that too when I was originally started out as certain positions that I held in the past. And once I realized what I was doing, that helped me to improve my way of thinking to become more impartial. And so I
Mm,
think that just the fact that they are just trying to benefit their emotional biases, which is a big part of human nature, isn't really an issue. I think it's a stepping stone to moving on to the more rational way of thinking.
yeah. Yeah. What's an example of like a view you had, let's say, on your epistemology that you thought worked, and then like you realize, oh wow, that obviously doesn't work, and like how you had to change it. Is there any specific example?
Yeah, I have a few examples. Fallibilism is the first one. So I didn't know anything about fallibilism. I kind of defined knowledge the same way the precepts did, is that you need absolute certainty or you don't have knowledge. And then Randall Rouser, a Christian theist philosopher, actually pointed this out to me, and in a few of our debates. And from that debate, when I started researching, I was like, "Oh crap, I'm wrong about this. Damn, I need to update my epistemology here."
Yeah.
Also, veganism, like I held the position that eating meat wasn't immoral, and then after writing my model of morality, I was like, "Oh well, crap, it's actually immoral to eat meat."
Mm. So, never mind. I'm not gonna ask you that. That might come across wrong. I was just gonna ask, like, are you vegan? But that's saying,
Nope, I eat cheeseburgers. I'm like, I just admit I'm immoral when I eat them. So
yeah, yeah. So, like, is there anything else you think would be helpful to talk about?
um, you said you've been researching this for about a year or so.
Yeah, like I'm gonna clarify that. I started during COVID, which I grown up in like an evangelical. I mean, I guess you can clarify as or define it as evangelical. Most of them are most of them I would say are pretty subs in that like anyone there's a verse in the Bible they take out of context that says anyone who comes to God must believe that He is, and they say, oh, well, see, these people don't see God because they don't believe God. If they believed Him, they would see God. And then I started thinking about that. Like I always just knew like there's just something not right about this. It just doesn't seem coherent. So I started thinking about it, and I'm like, just because Christianity teaches, the internal witness of the Holy Spirit, is how we know Christianity is true. And William Lane Craig says that that's sufficient enough, which I don't necessarily know about that. I don't think I don't, as of right now, I don't think it's necessarily properly basic, but they say so. Even if you have all this contradictory evidence, you just know it's true, so you don't have to worry about it. But that just seemed really dishonest to me. So I started looking into it, and it was mostly just like, very popular level apologetic stuff. Most of it, most preachers somewhere formulated it. And then very recently, someone recommended to me Richard Swinburne's book, The Existence of God. And I think now, but that was like a week ago. So like I was reading all these popular level books, and it felt like, I mean, I wasn't going anywhere. I feel like I wasted all my time because like most of this stuff is pretty, some of it at least is intuitive. But I've just recently started actually trying to look deeper into it, and I'm pretty much at the point where either way I don't care, what's true, and by that I mean if God exists, then I'll, if there's good reason to say He exists, then I'll be a theist. If not, whether I want Him to exist doesn't matter, so I'll be an atheist.
So
Um,
you do care about what's true, because you said I don't care about what's true, but you do care about what's true. It's like,
Yeah, yeah, but in the sense I don't. Obviously, I'd be lying if I said I didn't, want Christianity to be true because it's very scary, to completely abandon a worldview you've had all your life. But I'm saying that if I'm gonna be honest with myself, if there's good reason to say atheism is true, or there's no reason to believe in God, then there's no reason for me to reject that just because it makes me feel uncomfortable.
yeah, I
I
totally
mean,
agree. So I would say
just to
the same thing.
clarify, as of right now, I consider myself a Christian theist, but I'm just saying I don't have like I'm not like completely, against the idea of yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree. I would say that if evidence was provided that met my criteria and novel testable predictions, then I would admit the Christian God did exist. I'd be happy to do that. I wouldn't worship him
Yeah,
because of all of the Old Testament murder and stuff, which I don't
yeah.
agree with. But if there is sufficient evidence, I would gladly admit he exists for sure. So I think that that is an honest position to take, that you are willing to accept evidence and not try to just pursue your biases for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. So let's just say hypothetically, even if theism was internally, well, obviously you don't think that because you wouldn't worship him. But let's just say there's reason to think that he exists, and you be like, okay, theism, I believe in God. Um, why would you? Would that? I'm trying to formulate this really carefully because I don't know if this is just a bad idea. So if you came up to the idea, okay, I think that there exists a God based on these reasons. Do you think that would change your view of morality and therefore give you grounds to worship him, maybe?
No, I don't think so, because I think that,
Because you think it's objective, so yeah, it wouldn't
well,
change.
I
But
think that even if I granted God existed and my objective morality was not correct, I would still say that my intuition that drowning babies is morally wrong, I still think that would be correct. I still think that would be an objective moral fact. And so the fact that God in the Old Testament did world flood drowned millions of babies means that I couldn't think of the Christian God as being moral, even if he existed, and even if my morality was wrong, I'd still say whatever the correct morality is going to say drowning babies is wrong. God drowned babies, therefore God is immoral. Or and then there's lots of other examples from the Old Testament too. So I'd say that because my intuition that that one action is necessarily going to be wrong in whatever the objective morality is, the Christian one can't be right.
Okay.
And so I wouldn't worship the Christian God.
Do you think what do you think that like the possible there being a heaven and stuff like that, and the fact that God, if obviously you granted theism, you have to at least have some idea that He is just and all that stuff. Um, it would help with you clarifying what you mean, but like whenever you now believe that God exists, or you were convinced that God exists, do you agree that He's morally perfect as far because that's one of the attributes of God as far as on the theist account that he's morally good, he's all powerful, omnipotent, omniscient.
Yeah, so I wouldn't grant everything in the Bible. I would say that if you showed uh, miracles, like if you prayed to God and had him cure amputees or whatever, I would grant that the Christian God existed, but I wouldn't grant that he was all just because
Mhm.
what I understand morality to be, like drowning babies is wrong, would be a contradiction with that statement. So I'd say that in the Bible, the claim that God is all just, and in the Bible, the claim that God killed millions of people are contradictory statements internally inconsistent in the Bible. And so I wouldn't grant, I'd say that one was probably false. So even if I granted that God existed, God created the universe, Jesus rose from the dead, because there's a self contradiction in the Bible between those two statements, that one I'd have to claim is false. One of those is false. We know God exists, so that one can't be false. The one that must be false is that God is all just.
Okay. Do you think that maybe if God did exist, and this is arguing from the idea that you agree the Christian God exists, I'm not using this as an argument now. Um, wouldn't that be grounds to believe, oh, maybe my view of morality is skewed or not completely accurate? I think that would be a good reason to say, okay, at first I didn't think God exists for these reasons. Maybe part of them being morality, and I came to conclusion, okay, I believe God exists, the Christian God. Wouldn't that be grounds to maybe take a look at your morality or your view of morality?
Sure, sure, but I remember I said let's grant that I admit my model of morality is wrong. So
Oh, okay.
so if we just grant that and say that just looking at the Bible, if we imagine that the world had been created in a different way, like without any drowning babies, that world would have been morally better. Just using my moral intuitions, it seems like the strongest moral intuitions I have that seem to be the most likely to correspond to reality, that drowning babies is wrong. That one I think is irrefutably true. It's like if there is any morality, that's going to be a true statement about morality. And
Yeah.
because of that, I would say that it doesn't matter if God was all powerful, because he could have done this in a more moral way but didn't. That would mean he can't be perfectly moral.
Okay. And I think that makes sense too. Yeah. That's one thing I noticed is that a lot of maybe this is just because you know, um, I don't necessarily understand any certain positions altogether, but whenever most atheists seem to be at least somewhat consistent, like a lot of people would say they aren't, but at least, intellectually honest, there's this idea that atheists just are callous to the idea of there being a God, and they just kind of like how you would say Christians, they have the belief there's a God, and they arbitrarily make different explanations for how you could get there. They'd say, okay, atheists, not all of them, but this seems to be like a underlying
They just
idea
want to
that
sin.
yeah, that atheists are callous, and therefore they arbitrarily came up with all these explanations for why there isn't a God, which I don't think that's the case at all. But I forgot where I was even going with that. But I guess we could just talk about that then, since I brought it up.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think that attributing people's personality types is a issue that both sides have. In the
Yeah.
atheist community, there's a huge problem in the SJW community where people label someone as evil if they just bring up any criticism of an idea. They're like, oh, well, you're racist because you're saying anything wrong about black people. Like, racist, clearly you're evil. And so I think that that is a flaw in human nature that's in all all the communities pretty much, that they attribute some kind of malice or intent or motive to people rather than addressing their arguments or their reasons. And I think that is a fundamental flaw in human nature. I really like Halnon's Razor, which says, never attribute to malice that which could be explained by stupidity. Um, and I think that we should all, as humans, try to apply the principle of charity and look past any kind of assumed evil motive and just take
Mhm.
at face value what someone is saying rather than try to undercut or avoid the point they're making by calling them an evil person.
Okay. I remember you brought this up too in one of your other streams because I watch you all the time. Like I think it's interesting and like just fun. But you brought up that it was something about how Christians think that atheists they sin, or they just want to sin. I think that you said that's a misunderstanding, and you explain why. Like just go ahead and do that. I think that'd be helpful.
Sure, yeah. So when when you're a Christian, because I was a Christian, and
Yeah.
you see God as the perfect moral being, the highest standard of morality, and like you mentioned, that would mean that, well, everything God did was moral. So drowning babies was moral because God is the perfectly moral being. Stoning gay people to death is moral because God is the perfectly moral being. Uh, anti like single marriage, single what's it? Monogamous marriage is moral, and polyamory is immoral because this is what it says in the Bible. If you adopt all these positions that the Bible says because you think God is the height of morality and nothing is more moral, and then when you lose that and you become an atheist, it's not because you want to sin, because you want to do these evil things. It's usually the other way around, that you realize that, oh, the Bible actually wasn't right about this. There's a higher moral standard there that I was missing because I was a Christian. And I want to adopt this higher moral standard and recognize that Christianity was wrong about that moral thing. Not that I want to be immoral and just do sin. That's just the Christian perspective because they think God is the highest moral standard. And so they think that this action must be a sin, when really it's the other way around. The people who leave Christianity become to realize that, oh, that probably isn't actually a sin. It was just the only reason we thought that was because we were in that ideology which said so. But when you really analyze it from an independent standard, there's no real reason to think that would be a sin. Like, it's just like eating shellfish. Like, we don't consider eating shellfish to be a sin anymore. Why do we think that being gay is a sin? Like, especially since a lot of it's biological. You don't have a choice any more than you have a choice of being uh, white or black. It's like, you can't choose that. Is it a sin to be black? No. Why would it be a sin to be gay? It doesn't make any sense. So all of these different aspects that Christianity says are immoral seem to be factually incorrect when you analyze it from an independent standard and you're not already in the ideology. And so people leave the faith not because they want to sin, but because they realize those things aren't sins. There's no reason to consider those to be sins other than the fact that just God said so. And that confusion is very prevalent in the Christian side, that they think that, well, you just want to sin. You just want to not have to be accountable to God or whatever. And I think that is it's understandable why Christians think that, because they see God as the highest moral standard. But if they really took the time to think about it, I think they would realize that that's the reason they're leaving Christianity isn't because they want to venerate or
Yeah.
adhere to these things. It's because it's the fact that they left Christianity is why they think these things are probably not sins. There's a higher moral standard there that they think Christianity is wrong about, and that's the reason they're leaving isn't to sin. The reason they're leaving is because they think Christianity is false.
Okay. That's fair. Um. Hmm. Oh yeah. This is a question I had. Which of all the different God hypothesis, theism, deism, pantheism, all that stuff, which do you think at least is most consistent, or at least internally consistent?
Well, I definitely go with naturalistic pantheism, which is just the quantum field, essentially the same thing. But I think the more detail you add, the less probable it becomes. Just
Mm,
basic statistics. Like if you have a specific God who is rose Jesus from the dead or did this specific action at this specific point, that's obviously less likely than a general kind of a God that just
yeah.
doesn't interact with the world. And so I think that the more specific your belief is, without providing any supporting evidence, the worse, the less justified the position is. So, the without any supporting evidence, the more general, the better. And the more specific you make it, the more evidence you would need to make that position justified.
So, for example, if you had two hypotheses and both of them both, you know, had equal, let's say, justification, or and then one has a bunch of lists of these certain caveats, and one was a more simple form, because isn't that that's how it works in science, right? If you have two different theories, if it's one that's more most simplest is most probable, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Because for each added thing in your theory, you would have to support that added thing with some kind of an evidence to say, well, why do you think that thing is there?
Did, I think I forget which philosopher it was. I think it was maybe Swinburne, because I've just maybe it was. I think I saw it in like some interview or whatever. He was saying that God's attributes, like omni attributes, like all powerful, all knowing and stuff like that, that's actually simple, is most simple, because he said the most simple kind of thing is either if it's no property at all, or if it's infinite, or like the
Yeah,
stuff
I
like that.
think his term is that any arbitrary limitations make the thing more complicated.
Yeah, I think it's
Uh,
what it is too.
I think that's weird. I think that idea
Yeah.
is completely backwards. Like adding a limitation doesn't seem to be making it more complicated. It seems to be making it less complicated. Like if I have an engine that can go 1,000,000 miles per hour, that seems significantly more complicated than an engine that can go 30 miles an hour. Um, so saying that it has a limited speed doesn't seem to be an added limitation. It seems to be just uh, it doesn't seem to be make it more complicated. It seems the limitations describing the properties within it. The limitation itself doesn't seem to be an added property, so it seems strange to think that adding limitations somehow adds a property to be added into the complexity there. It doesn't make any sense. Like it seems to go the other way around. Like this knife that I'm holding, this seems very
Mhm.
limited, but it's very simple. Like, why would making it less limited make it more simple? That seems to be the opposite case. That would be like saying this knife, which has a bunch of stuff in it, is more simple because it has less limitations. Like, what? That doesn't make any sense.
Here, how do you think that? Because there are a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily say that that idea is absurd. I don't think you necessarily would either. But there are people that come up with, this is like off the, this is kind of irrelevant. There's a lot of people that come up with these weird, absurd ideas and try to use it as an argument for or against theism. Why do you think that happens? Like, do you think they actually honestly think that that's the case and they just haven't? Or,
Well, I think it's with anything in science, you start with a hypothesis, and you then say, well, if my hypothesis is true, well, what can we do to what would this lead? What would the consequences of this be? And so, if Swinburne's and Plantinga's idea of God, of this perfectly simple thing, is true, well, then, in order for that to be the case, then simplicity has to be very different than what we think of it. There has to be some other way to measure
Mhm.
simplicity. And the way that they have justified that is by saying that this limitations property is the real measure of simplicity. And so having no limitations makes you more simple. And so I think it's a way to justify their belief or to make their belief fit their worldview, which is perfectly fine, but I don't think there's any evidence to support it. So I think that starting with a hypothesis and making a worldview that could try to fit the hypothesis is what they're doing, which there isn't an issue with that if you can use that hypothesis to come up with some independent way to verify it, which I don't think they've done. So I think that they've essentially just made up a new property of this limitedness thing and said this is the true essence of simplicity, which is also a real property that they're claiming exists. And these two real properties, which are fundamental to the universe, lead to something which is perfectly simple and has no limitations. And that's as a deductive argument, that's fine. The problem is, well, why do you think either of those things actually correspond to reality? Like simplicity, we tend to grant in science simplicity is better,
Mhm.
but why would this limitedness thing be a part of simplicity? Like that's not something in science. No one seems to accept that except the theists. And so that seems to be a very dubious claim, a dubious addition that doesn't seem to have any support for it as far as I can tell.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool. We've been going for a little over an hour now. It was great chatting with you. I really enjoyed our
Yeah,
conversation.
yeah,
You want to
yeah.
plug your YouTube channel again just to get some more content there?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel name is Confident Faith, which I want to explain like what it's even there for. I started it just because I've kind of like started this I don't want this to be seen like a cliche. I started this journey pretty much in a way where I'm you know weighing the options of is there a God, is there not a God. So pretty much what I do is I present certain ideas or things that I've learned on the channel that might help one Christians have a more confident faith, and it also gives the opportunity for people to bounce back and show whether that's even so it's kind of a double-edged sword, which maybe is not a good idea, but yeah. So if you wanted to check that out or want to critique some of my videos, that would be helpful. It's Confident Faith. You might have to search up specifically like there's a lot of different channels like that. Maybe Confident Faith discussion with Eric Hernandez, because I know that has a lot bigger platform than I do, and it should come up, or TomJump can link it in the description later.
Yeah,
So yeah,
post a comment and I will because uh, just say thanks or whatever, and I can tag
pin
it,
it.
pin it, and then it'll just link directly
Yeah,
to your
so if
channel.
if you enjoyed this discussion I had with TJump, or at least I didn't present a whole lot, just I was just trying to be honest, and there's a lot of that on my channel, then just go ahead and subscribe. I really appreciate that. And I think it'd be helpful too, because if one of my end goals is to, have certain ideas, and kind of bounce them off ideas and show how maybe this would give theists confidence in our faith, because it is a biblical kind of term, but the more people there are, the more ideas there are, and that's more helpful, I think. So yeah, so please subscribe. I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks again. Really enjoyed the conversation, and I wish you the best of luck with your YouTube channel. I will talk to you later.
Yep. Thank you.